Masaf International Institute. Uncovering the truth.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, my name is Zainab Christian James. I am Scottish. I grew up in Germany, went to school there. Then I studied at Oxford University in the UK. Then I moved to Australia. I worked as a high school teacher. I have 3 kids. And now I live full-time in Iran. I live here, I work as a writer, and I also study at Hausa. So I'm going to talk about a few topics in a moment. And obviously everything I talk about is always related to and from the perspective of who I am, which is a foreign woman living in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I'd like to talk about hijab first, because especially in the last week, there have been many debates in the media about hijab. I would focus on 3 points. So the first thing I would say is that obviously hijab is a religious issue. And even though I'm actually a Hausa student, so a Talibé, I myself would not, for example, refer to a passage in the Quran and try to interpret it. So as it's a religious issue, I would myself refer to the senior clerics, to the ayatollahs, to actually explain what the verse in the Quran actually means regarding the hijab. Now, secondly, obviously, we've seen lots in the media, many people outside of Iran talking about hijab, Muslim, non-Muslim. And again, so hijab in Iran is actually also a matter for the Iranian public, because this concerns this country. So again, I'm not really going to comment on that, because I think it's best for me as a foreigner to actually give respect to the Iranian people and to the Iranian country, that this is an issue that is really also for Iran to discuss. However, there is one point regarding hijab which obviously I should be commenting on. I feel very strongly about it. And that is that in the Western media, one argument that is often brought about, or usually brought up with regard to the hijab, is that it deprives women of freedom. Now, and that always makes me think of one particular aspect of this, and that is that obviously many women choose to work, and so I wonder, what is the impact of actually wearing hijab when they go to work? And I'm sure many people are aware that in many Western countries there are quite severe limitations now. So it really obviously depends on the job that people have. But if I just list some of the countries where we're actually seeing issues with women who want to work and wear hijab. So I'd start with, for example, Quebec in Canada. They have something called Bill 21, which means that women who wear hijab really can't be sort of frontline workers who are seen by the public. And whereas we would think that, well, maybe that just affects government workers, lawyers, or so, it also affects people such as teachers, childcare workers. So it's actually quite extensive. We have, since I think about 2009 or so in Germany, we've actually had something that is called a neutrality policy in Germany, which means that there should be no religious symbols at work. And even though there are conditions attached to that, what it actually in effect does mean is that women might be discriminated against if they wear hijab. So they might lose their job, or they might not be employed in a particular workplace. Obviously, the workplaces will differ depending on whether they actually stick by this. But I do just this week I was reading about the case of, I think, a Syrian lady who wore hijab, who had managed to get a job as a childcare worker, I think, or as a teacher of young children. She sent in her application with a photo. She was accepted. She was given the job. But then when she turned up to this new workplace, the manager turned her away and said she couldn't have the job. So whoever obviously saw her photo, which was with hijab, didn't realize that they have this neutrality policy. And they actually have something called a neutrality policy, which applies in France too. So they have a new legislation which is called anti-separatism bill. And what that really is very similar to what they have in Germany, but just that it's much broader. So they apply that to, for example, all women. So anyone who wears, for example, a hijab in the public sector, but also the private contractors to the public sector. So that's just talking about, obviously, the West. And I was thinking about and remembering that, obviously, because I live in Iran, I'm quite aware of the sorts of different jobs that women can have here, and obviously having a hijab is not a problem. And so in this country, there are female pilots, obviously there are female lawyers. Oh yes, I forgot to say that in France, for example, it's difficult for women to wear hijab. So there was a court in northern France that said that they can't have a female hijabi working in court. But in Iran, having a hijab does not bar from being engaged in any sort of job. And then I immediately thought back to the fact that, the city where I live in, obviously I've used taxis many times, and quite a number of times I've been in taxis with female drivers. And that made me think, and I remembered that even though I've grown up and lived in different countries in the West, I actually can't remember ever having had a female taxi driver in a Western country. And that also got me thinking, well, why is that? That's odd, really. And the only reason I can actually give to that is the fact that, well, maybe it's just not safe enough for female taxi drivers in some of these Western countries. So there are special taxi services that are by females, for females, but female sort of taxi driver in the West I just haven't come across, because obviously they'd have to deal with maybe some quite dangerous behavior from some of the people they drive about. So that's just things relating directly to hijab. And hijab, even though, and I will just briefly talk about what hijab does. So hijab does give women the sort of dignity to go about their daily lives, go about their public lives, just with a bit more protection and being treated in a more respectful way. So that's just my opinion, my comment on that. But obviously I'm sure people want to hear about what I have to say about what's been happening this last week. And so again, I was having a little bit of a read. I was trying to find out particular things that I found a bit strange. But before I talk about what's happened this week, I think the very first thing I should say is also publicly to just offer my condolences both to the family of the girl who obviously has, a young woman rather, Masaf, who died. And obviously that investigation is ongoing. And also offer my condolences to the families of all the police officers and the security officers, and also of the innocent bystanders who've been martyred or injured over this last week in Iran. Now, one thing I thought I would do is that, because obviously I've had a quick look on social media, and I was wondering, so what exactly happened? What was the timeline of what happened over these last 10 days, basically? And so I just did a little search, and I realized, well, and people are very aware of this, that we have particular media outlets, such as Iran International and BBC, but Iran International is really prolific in this, who have produced a massive campaign to do with first the death of the young woman, and then after that reporting obviously on what's been happening on the streets, especially in the evenings and at night. So I tried to go right back to where the first mention was by Iran International of anything to do with this young woman. And obviously with that in mind, I'm also going to just remind people that the family of the young woman actually asked or stated that her death has nothing to do with these other events that have taken place. So they wanted that to be kept separate. But so I went back in the timeline, and I realized that on the 15th of September, was the first time when Iran International mentioned the name of this woman, and the way they reported it was that obviously this woman had fallen into a coma, having been beaten severely by the police. I think that's almost the exact words they used. And so this was actually Thursday, 15th of September, 2 days before the day of Arba'in. And obviously the rest of the media, at least in this region, or in Iran and also in Iraq a lot, to do with Arba'in. So an amazing event this year. I'd like to also just add and put in there, because it was huge. And so the images this year, the reports this year in Arba'in were actually the best ever, in my opinion, from the few years that I've been observing it. But so just going back to it, so 15th of September, the Thursday, Iran International reports on this woman. And it's the following day that, for example, an Iranian news channel mentions, and what their mention of the young woman is that she had died. And then after that, immediately this campaign started from Iran International. And so Iran International said that she was beaten severely by the police. And the words they used were, Iran International has learned. So obviously they never give their sources. And I have to add that Iran International was also, I don't know whether fully responsible, but partly responsible for this other story which broke about the same time, that the leader of the country, the Rahbar, had fallen very ill. And it's something that I can't quite add up in my mind. So how come this incident that happens in Iran is reported even earlier by this other channel, which is located in the UK, and we were told that it's funded by the Saudis. And obviously then it took over. And it's interesting that the hashtags, the trends, have become so huge. So when I went onto the social media, I was looking at the numbers, I really couldn't believe it. With hundreds of thousands. Iran is not usually of that much interest to the West at least, not the rest of the world. And so anyway. But this is not really anything new. We're aware of this. But there is something else going on, and this is something that concerns me, and this is what I'm always thinking about. And what it is that, so whichever Western channel it is, so they have a particular way of reporting the stories that will immediately target the emotions of their readers, of the people who are consuming this media. And obviously we just need to sort of see this as a bigger picture. So people are, and I'm actually talking about people in the West right now. So people in the West are big consumers. Anyone who has any interest in Iran will probably be reading Iran International, for example. So they're the consumers of this media. And this media is sensationalizing, first of all fabricating, then sensationalizing. And this is deliberate because they are trying to trigger emotions in people. And the overall consequence of this is, and this is just something I see playing out in media in general, is that people's emotions are being triggered. So now I always wonder, well, are they losing the capacity to actually reason? Are they actually going to be able to sort of take a step back and analyze the events? Actually look at something very reasonably and say, okay, well, where are the facts? So this is really it's going to become very difficult for people to actually be able to do that. So if we as human beings are always just being triggered, our emotions are being triggered, then obviously this is going to sort of become stronger in us. And so this is obviously where international media, where Western media are sort of playing to. And this leads just to another point. So for example, I, as a Westerner, definitely see that any sort of culture of, so any intellectual culture, it seems to be disappearing. There is definitely not a culture of debate. In the West, it seems, there's just one narrative, and that is the narrative that plays out in these news channels. And it gets so ridiculous that when I visit my father in Scotland, a friend visits my father in his house, and the friend admits with a sort of hushed whisper and says, "Oh, by the way, I actually have Russian background," and this person is obviously ashamed to even say that. And I don't understand what is happening. But these all hang together with the game that the media play. And when I say Western media, and I say Iran International, based in the UK, obviously I need to mention the BBC because they play the same game. Maybe they don't have quite as many reports out there as Iran International, because Iran International is all about Iran. But this is the same, and we always have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on? And I'll just jump back to the timeline of events. And it's very strange. So we had this wonderful event of Arba'in, which was barely reported in Western media, of course. Hugely reported here. And there have been glowing reports, so people have really been impressed this year. And then we have the tragic death in Iran. So we have the Kurd, what happens with the woman called Masaf. And then we have to remind ourselves at the same time there's something else going on. So it's always about the big picture, what's happening. These are not isolated incidents. We have to remind ourselves that the sort of discussions, talks about the JCPOA, are also still ongoing. And we then have to remind ourselves, negotiations, talks, there's always the backwards and forwards, and then the US will say something else. The US puts some more sanctions on. And then, as soon as we say the US and we mention JCPOA, we must also remind ourselves that there's someone always pushing the US, not just a someone, but a country. So there's a country called Israel, which we obviously call Palestine, but this country is always pushing the US along. These are just questions I put out there because obviously people are well aware of this. So we have what's going on in Iran over this past week. We have still open-ended discussion on the JCPOA as to when this will actually be finalized and written, agreed. And so everything I've said is really just to try and get everyone to think. And obviously people in Iran, but ideally people outside of Iran, because the having a culture in which we discuss, in which we analyze events, in which we may preferably even look back and try to learn from what's happened in the past is hugely important. And there is another incident, event, which I'd like to throw in here, which also is about the media and which things the media actually portrays. So roughly about the same time of the death of the woman here in Iran, which is under investigation, a young girl, a 15-year-old teenager, was martyred, was killed by stray bullets from a US base in Iraq. So her name was Zainab, and she, from what I read, she was helping her father. He's in the field, and so she got killed. And it's very strange because there was almost nothing about it in the media. And even now, there's so little. Obviously, she's already been buried, and still there's so little about her. And I know that many people can answer this question when I ask, so how come death happens in this country? And we see a huge response from the West. And then a death happens in neighboring Iraq. caused, from what we read, and it seems to have been, at least this is what has been reported in the news channels, by bullets from a US base. And how come that woman's death did not cause this sort of response in the West? Why are they not concerned with 15-year-old Zainab? And of course, I'll just give my opinion, because we know that the US, whether it's recklessness, negligence, or whatever else, is obviously responsible for that, because the bullets came from the base in their base. And people, that's of no interest. And this goes back to the narrative. And the question is, so what can we do? What can we do to change people's perception of what's going on? How can we help people to actually open their minds so they can look at what's going on in the world, whichever country they're in, study the events and wonder, and maybe actually themselves observe, well, this thing happens there, and it's turned into a global trending hashtag. Something else happens also to us, of a young woman in another country, and there's nothing. So these, because obviously if we do not do this, we're going to, bit by bit, all of us become dumber and dumber and less able to reason critically. And it really doesn't take very much. So, for example, I was going back and seeing, and just also asking myself, so when people say to me, when I read, oh, but this, what's happened in Iran, and I call them riots, by the way. I don't call, when people are killed, when police officers are more or less slaughtered, that's my words, that's not a protest. Protests are normal in all countries. Iran sees protests, peaceful protests, but when people come armed like that to what they call a protest, and when they say it's about a woman, it's about women's rights, it's about hijab, and I look at the images and I see hardly any women, I'm saying to myself, why is it all men, or almost all men? And I was looking at some of the images from the protests that happened after the killing of George Floyd in the US. I'm sure everyone remembers. And I was just studying the timeline and the footage, the images from the protests. And I thought, okay, so this is a black guy. And yet when I look at the footage, but half of the people at the protests are women. And yet if this is, the West is saying that this is about women's rights in Iran, well, the women aren't there. But again, this is just my way of framing what I see as an observer, and I just hope that people start to distance themselves from media that are trying to feed one narrative and that really are just going to dumb down and decrease people's capacity to reason critically. And do always ask yourself, who does this benefit? Because the less critical we become, the less able we are to reason, to see patterns, to try to ask questions. Well, I would tend to say that sooner or later, the dumbing down is also going to lead to normalization. The normalization that sadly some of the Arab states in the region, their leaders have agreed to. That doesn't mean that the people agree with them. But obviously the more that people consume media, which decreases our critical thinking ability, the more we're on this very slippery slope to even accepting normalization, just because we really cannot reason anymore. We cannot put two and two together. We cannot remind ourselves, well, the plan of the Saudi-funded, the US-funded, the UK-funded media is always pushed along, abetted by Israel. And obviously as Muslims, and actually as global citizens who decry oppression and tyranny, we must always say no to normalization and no to Israel as the entity it is. And I'll actually leave my speech just on that. It was about Iran, and it's always about Iran, but it's really about thinking critically. And that's, and I'll add that obviously that is one thing that Iran also teaches me. And as a woman, as a hijabi, I actually have the intellectual freedom to do that here and to explore that. So, but alhamdulillah.
Masaf International Institute. Uncovering the truth.